Welcome. Oh, there you go. Welcome, everyone. My name is Dr. Natalie Muñoz, and I'm excited to be in community with you all today. I graduated from Howard University in spring of 2023, and I am currently a assistant professor at Rutgers University, Newark campus. And so today I'm going to be talking a little bit about my experience in the PhD program and just providing some survival tips for students. So we'll get started. So just a little bit about my story. I am from New York City. I grew up in Elmhurst, Queens, which is a very diverse neighborhood. Um, and I decided to go to Howard because of my experiences working at predominantly white institutions. And I had experienced a lot of sexism and a lot of racism, especially because I was working in the Office of Multicultural Affairs at the time during President Trump's initial 4-year term. And so the students that I was working with were dealing with a lot of racial trauma on campus, receiving text messages of, African Americans being noosed, and then also even being called the N-word. And growing up in New York City and in a very diverse neighborhood, I always had like a strong sense of like Pan-Africanism, but also like Black and Latino solidarity. And so, I also identify as Afro-Latina. So that was really what drew me to going to an HBCU. And so, interesting enough, my journey was a bit unique in the sense that a few months prior to going to Howard, I was in a car accident that really impacted my lower spine. And so I was dealing with migraines, um, lower back pain, shooting nerve pain. I mean, I was physically not well. That was the biggest challenge because now I was moving from California to Washington, D.C. I had never lived in Washington, D.C. I had never even visited the Howard campus. And so having to ask for help to be able to even just get my personal items to Howard was super difficult. And one of the things that I had to do in order to survive was apply for accommodations through the Office of Disabilities. And so that was the best decision that I did going into the PhD program because it, by law, allowed me to have certain accommodations, such as being able to stand in class, extra time for assignments if I had a back spasm, or if I was feeling, just a lot of pain, and extra time for exams as well. So I would, strongly encourage as part of your survival, if you have any challenges, whether it's a
Dr. Muse,
physical.
sorry to interrupt you. Mr. Hayes, could you mute yourself, please? We can hear you.
Okay. Um, so I would suggest that whatever, challenges you may have, whether it's a physical or even mental health, because the Office of Disabilities also works with students who maybe have anxiety, depression, um, bipolar, ADHD, right? To make sure by law that faculty are abiding by the accommodations that they need to be successful in the classroom. And so I think, that was definitely a huge part of my survival. Getting to Howard, I kind of came in assuming that, being Afro-Latina, that I would like automatically make friends, and that was not the case. My cohort, from the moment they saw me, did not want to be my friend. They didn't even like talk to me. They would exclude me from events. And so my first year was actually very isolating. And it wasn't the experience that I expected going into an HBCU. However, I was very intentional to network outside of my cohort. And so I made sure to make friends in other departments, start talking to faculty as well within my department, but also in other departments. And by my second year, after joining the Graduate Student Council, I had a much stronger sense of like my community, my tribe, and students who were very warm, welcoming, and made me feel a sense of belonging at Howard. And for that, I am very grateful. But it does take some time initially. And I think, that's the reality regardless of what school you go to. But I think, part of it being, maybe even just cultural differences within the cohort and the cohort being so small. I just want to say that even if you don't get along with your cohort, that there is still potential to create a community outside of your cohort. It did take me 5 years to finish the PhD. In the social work department, you have to do 2 years of coursework. They have two examinations that you have to take, one after the first year and then one after the second year. And then I spent 3 years working on the dissertation. And so I finished my dissertation on the understanding the experiences of Afro-Latino college students at HBCUs, because after my personal experience, I wanted to kind of better understand other Afro-Latinos college experiences, and knowing the rich history that HBCUs have in creating a positive ethnic racial identity for African Americans. I really wanted to understand, okay, well, what is the impact, right, of HBCUs on other Blacks, right? So what is the impact on their ethnic racial identity and mental health of Afro-Latino students? And so I'm going to go into a little bit more strategic tips in terms of things that I did throughout my journey, from self-love, building community, mentoring, some common challenges that you may face, and then even some tips on committee selection, and then lastly, just a few random tips and tricks to end. In terms of my self-care, I will say that had I not gone to therapy, I would not have made it through those 5 years in the PhD. My term during the PhD included COVID. It included the protest, around the murder of George Floyd. I mean, there was so much political violence happening and protesting in DC at the time that really therapy is what held me down throughout the program. And therapy is offered at Howard for free to graduate students in the counseling center. So if it is something that you have been considering or seeking, I would suggest to definitely sign up for an appointment. Sometimes you do have to be a little bit, consistent and maybe go in person. But I will say, once they assigned me a therapist, I had a really great experience. The other rule of thumb that I used throughout my program to survive was that my weekends were sacred. And obviously, I'm sharing my personal journey, but I also understand that everyone's PhD journey looks completely different, right? So I just want to acknowledge that, and that there is no one way to survive the PhD. But for me, centering my joy was super important, and not working on weekends and not writing on weekends was part of my way of finding a balance. Okay, so I only did homework and writing on the weekdays or the weeknights in between classes or work schedules, but I did not like religiously not work on weekends. And I recognize, again, that is a privilege, because I know some people have families and children, and it might not be a realistic thing to not work the whole weekend. But even if you make Sunday your day when you don't do any work but just find some joy, I think it's really important, because it's very easy to burn out with the PhD. I did also make some sacrifices when it came to my work schedule. When I started out my first year, um, I was not working. My second year, I took on a full-time job. My third year, I was completely burnt out. And my fourth and fifth year, I was able to find like a side hustle that allowed me a more flexible schedule and to work part-time. And that was like my saving grace to make it through the last 2 years. So I did not work full time while I was writing the dissertation. And I did that strategically because I wanted to graduate. I was already feeling burnt out, and I felt like I really needed like whatever energy I had left in me to finish the dissertation and get out as soon as possible. Um, The other thing I did was celebrate the small wins. So a lot of times people are like, oh, I'm gonna celebrate after I graduate. No. Whether it was popping champagne, cutting a cake. I mean, I brought my friends over, I hosted parties, but it was like after my first comprehensive exam, I threw myself a party. After my other exam, I popped champagne bottles and threw champagne. I don't even drink alcohol, but I just did it for the joy of watching champagne shoot out of a bottle. Um, so, I would say do not wait to celebrate life, to celebrate your wins. If you got a publication, you better celebrate, right? Like if you win an award, a fellowship, you better celebrate. If you get a grant, you need to celebrate. If you wait until graduation, you're doing yourself a disservice because nothing in this life is guaranteed, right? The other thing I would say is movement and nutrition. I had an accountability PhD friend, Felipe, who he just graduated last year. Some of you may know him, but we used to hold each other accountable and do yoga virtually, like at least once a week. And that was really what got us through the pandemic as PhD students and making sure that I was eating right, and taking breaks because if you're just going for 10 hours, what you're producing is not going to be quality work. So even if it means you take a nap for 3 hours and go back to writing, once you go back to writing, your brain's going to be rested, and what you're going to produce, you're going to be able to do it in a faster amount of time. And then the last thing I'll say when it comes to self-care is you need to check yourself in terms of where are you seeking validation. If you're constantly seeking validation from others, from academia, from these institutions, you're just going to literally drain yourself. Like you need to know that you are enough. You need to know that your validation has come within. That regardless of whether you finish this PhD or not, that you are worthy, right? And I think that you can do that with affirmations, you could do that with meditation in the morning, but you cannot allow this PhD to dictate your worth, right? As a human being, as as a student in any capacity. So I think, making sure that your internal validation is in check is also super important to survive the PhD process. I mean, I had a colleague when I first started that was very honest with me that the first few months when they started their program, they stopped doing their hair. And it was to the point where they basically had to shave their head because their hair was so knotted after months of not doing their hair and self-caring and self-loving, um, because they were so overwhelmed with the workload that they just forgot about themselves, right? And so we don't want to get to that point, right? We want to take time to self-love, to self-care, and let that also allow us to propel us throughout the academic journey, right? Because yeah, it's great if you have a PhD, but not if you have a stroke while you're doing it, which I had colleagues who had strokes during their comprehensive exams. So, self-care, it may sound like a simple thing, but it is like one of the most important things that you should be doing as a PhD student at every point in the process. On this slide, you'll see a bunch of QR codes. If you scan these QR codes, It's gonna give you access to some online communities that I was a part of. I'm sure there are more communities out there, but these are ones that I specifically was able to engage with. If anyone in that's on today has any other communities that you've engaged with virtually that were supportive, please feel free to drop it in the chat for the rest of the students on the live. But on Twitter, there is a support group called First Gen Docs, and they do a lot of posting about first gen experiences in doctoral programs, tips, tricks, and all kinds of like supportive resources. And so I found a lot of community participating in their tweets. And so if you're looking to find like more virtual communities, the following, they call it X, not Twitter anymore, but following the First Gen Docs on X or Twitter is a really great support opportunity. If you identify as Latina on Facebook, there's also a group that I was a part of that's called Latinas Completing Doctoral Degrees. And that was an amazing hub for me on Facebook of people sharing so many resources. And I know they have similar Facebook groups for Black doctoral degrees. So if you just go into Facebook and search, you can find that as well. One of the other groups that I was a part of virtually was the Black Doc groups. Now, this group originally was on GroupMe, and then with like in the last 3 years, they switched to an app that's called Discord. And Discord is kind of similar to GroupMe in that it's a mass group texting app, but it also allows you to kind of create little chat rooms. And so they have like a wealth of knowledge on the Discord Black Docs chat. And that includes, Black doctoral students from all over the country. So if you're looking to connect with other scholars across the country who are also in the same process as you and build community, those are some really great virtual communities. As I mentioned earlier, I didn't have community within my cohort, so that was, not an asset of my experience, but hopefully that's not the case for all of you. But like I said, there is ways to build communities outside of your cohort with other grad students. One of those ways that I did that was joining the Graduate Student Council. At one point, I was their chair of, I think, volunteering. Then I became the vice president, and then I became the president of the Graduate Student Council. And that was an amazing way for me to develop peer mentorship relationships, because within the council, you'll meet people at different timing in their PhD, right? So I always say it's good to know someone who's maybe like 1 year ahead of you. It's good to know someone who's like 1 year from graduating, right? And that you need to be very intentional about having two of those people on your community team so that when you get to those places, you can ask questions and just make sure that you're on track. Obviously, having family, friends that are supportive, going to conferences if that's something that you can afford, or working with faculty that have grants that can take you to a conference, right? Applying for grants so that you can go to conferences. And then I even actually joined undergraduate student clubs. So as an Afro-Latina, there are no clubs or for grad students who identify as Afro-Latina. However, there is an undergrad club called Chango, and I found so much community and so much love with the undergrads. So if you're like LGBTQ and there's no grad spaces for you, or any other identity where you're like, wow, they don't have a grad space for me, definitely look into the undergrad clubs, because you can still find a lot of community, a lot of networking, and a lot of belonging in those spaces as well. And then the last thing I'll say about building community is Howard has something that's called the consortium, and the consortium allows you to take courses outside of Howard with local universities in Washington, D.C. Now, this is an amazing opportunity because if Howard doesn't offer a course that you're interested in, you could potentially go take it at another university while still paying the same tuition that you would pay at Howard. So if there is a scholar that you're like, wow, they got an amazing grant, I would love to work under them, you could go take a class with them, and that would be a good way to start maybe an informal mentorship relationship with that faculty at the other university who maybe is doing similar research to what you're doing, right? So the consortium is, I know people who got grants through that because they took a class with the faculty out in the consortium. They ended up getting a grant within the year. They already saw like, wow, this student is great in my classroom, and they were able to like bring them on as a research assistant as well. So you're not just limited to, research assistant opportunities, just at Howard. You can actually find opportunities outside of Howard easily using the consortium and still not having to pay any extra money because it's already part of your student experience. I'm going to talk about two forms of mentoring. I'm going to talk about informal mentoring and then formal mentoring and how they impacted my survival. So the ways that I engaged in informal mentoring were very strategic. I enrolled in independent studies. If there was a professor that I saw was doing amazing work that I was like, damn, I would love to work with them and maybe I want them on my committee, I'm like, I'm gonna enroll in an independent study with them first to see how our working relationship is. And then if that works out, then that might be a solid person that I'm gonna put on my committee. Or maybe we don't like each other, which is okay. Like, not everybody is for everybody. But at least now you know that may not be a professor that would be a good working collaboration for you in the future, and that you might not want them on your committee. And even though they may have similar research interests, your personalities clash, right? And so getting to know faculty before you ask them to be on your committee is super important. And doing an independent study is a great way to kind of get to know their energy, the way that they work, and just their personality in general. Applying to be a research assistant, like I said, also a great opportunity. And you can look for that at Howard, but you could also look off campus through the consortium and see what you can find as well. Becoming a teaching assistant. Usually when you become a teaching assistant, they assign you a professor. I know not all departments allow students necessarily to teach, but you never know if you don't ask and if you don't advocate, maybe it's something that you could bring to your department. I know in the School of Social Work, they did allow us to teach classes, and it was a great experience because the faculty mentor that I was assigned to would come in once in a blue just to kind of like see how I was engaging the students, but it also allowed me to build rapport with that professor so they could see my skills in the classroom. And, that was kind of also like me almost like interviewing potentially. That's kind of like how I treated my whole experience at Howard when I engaged with faculty. I presented myself as if I was like in an interview, right? Because what I wanted to display was that even when I graduate, that I would still be an amazing candidate to work at Howard. And it worked in my favor because actually my dean, after graduating, offered me a position to teach at Howard. However, I decided to take a position at Rutgers Newark because I wanted to be closer to family, right? And so, I think it's really important that, a lot of times you think like, oh, I'm just a student, but no, people are watching. Building your brand early is super important. Co-authoring a publication with a professor, right? So that's another way to kind of get to understand their leadership style, work with them, see how they write, and publish, which if you want to go in the academic route, it is important to have a few publications before graduating. I graduated, I think, with at least three or four publications. And so I felt very, very good about that, right? Taking on leadership roles in the Graduate Student Council, as I mentioned earlier, it's a great opportunity for peer mentorship, but also, I was meeting regularly with the dean of the graduate school and the provost of the university, and being in those leadership meetings really allowed me to build an even stronger rapport across campus with administrators and other faculty and put me in rooms that I probably wouldn't have been able to access had I not stepped up and joined leadership. And like I said earlier, you really should be very intentional about inviting a grad student out for coffee who is in your department, is 1 year older than you, and who is in your department and 1 year away from graduating. And you should have them saved on your phone and at least do one check-in a semester, to make sure that you're on track and see how you can support each other, right? Because you never know. It should always be a two-way street of peer mentoring, right? The next thing I want to talk about is formal mentoring. So I also joined a lot of organizations outside of Howard that were based with my career. So I joined the American Association of Hispanics in Higher Education. I applied for their Latino grad student fellowship program. I got accepted. It allowed me to travel to a conference and get to know Latino faculty, well, future faculty and Latino graduate students from all over the country. And also they assigned me a mentor that worked with us throughout the whole year through that program. So I'm sure there are other programs out there that exist depending on, what department that you're in, but you should be talking to your professors, asking about these opportunities. Do they know of any formal mentorship opportunities? There's some programs that offer like weekend retreats where they do like formal mentoring for a weekend in the summer. Howard does have a little bit of mentoring built in. The HU Preparing Future Faculty certification, I think, was ways that I engaged in mentoring while I was at Howard and participating in their workshops. They had a symposium, I think, one time where they brought in faculty and they looked at your CVs. And that was super helpful for me, to have like that time to sit down with a professor and talk about my CV and what I needed to do to improve, but also what I needed to start doing and thinking of that I could add to my CV before graduating. Participating in Rutgers Research Month, I think this is a phenomenal opportunity to start getting your research out there. Just, you don't want to wait until you have to defend your proposal or defend your dissertation to be talking about your research. You should be doing it as often as possible because that's gonna make you more confident in your research, gonna build your brand. And when you go to the RU research, they have like a day of like where the students all come together and just do conference sessions or like paper sessions. It's a great way to get feedback from faculty because after you present, the faculty will sit with you and give you feedback on your presentation, and then you can submit that proposal to a national conference or an international conference with that feedback already incorporated. So that's going to increase your opportunity to get approved to go and speak at a national conference. But also it's going to help you get some tips on how to improve your speaking skills. In the summer, Howard also offers like online virtual workshops, which I found really helpful, and I actually did every year. I think they were like tired of me signing up, but they were the summer quantitative methods, mixed methods, and qualitative methods workshops. And it was just good as a refresher, right? Because after you finish your coursework and now you're, in data collection or data analysis, like it's good to have these like refresher classes available, so that this information stays fresh in your mind. So if you are getting closer to dissertation, I would suggest definitely look into those workshops. They usually send a few emails toward the end of the spring. And they do have like a limited capacity, so just make sure you sign up for those workshops. So will you have challenges? So I put here, you have two scenarios, true or true. The truth is you will have challenges no matter what. There is no one I ever met that got through the PhD that did not have challenges along the way. And so I want to just talk briefly about some of the other challenges that I experienced and that actually a lot of my classmates um, uh, and colleagues also experience, right? So The first one is normalizing getting stuck. Okay. I got stuck all the time. You know, I think you get stuck when you're like, oh my God, what am I gonna do my research on? Right? And then you get stuck and you're like, oh my God, okay, now I know what I wanna research, but like who am I gonna actually interview? And then you get stuck and you're like, okay, well, now I know who I wanna interview, but what am I actually gonna ask them? And so it is so normal. Now you collect all the freaking data and you're like, oh my God, what am I gonna write in the conclusion? And you're stuck. So the point is that we need to normalize getting stuck. Getting stuck is a part of life. That is common. There is no one who went through a PhD that didn't get stuck. But that's why when you set up these self-care techniques, when you set up your community, you phone a friend, you phone a mentor, you phone a peer mentor. I can't tell you, you know, my colleague Stacy, she's graduating this semester and I'm so proud of her, but she would phone me and be like, yo, I'm stuck. And I'm like, let's just talk it out. And you'll be surprised how sometimes just talking it out will move you through, right? The other thing I tell people when you feel stuck is go read. Stop whatever you're doing, go read and see what comes, right? And then do it again. Call someone else, read, call someone else, read until you get unstuck, right? And so I think that's the biggest thing is just being persistent. And you were gonna get burned out. I don't think anyone gets through a PhD without getting burned out at least once, but being able to recognize those signs and lean on those support systems that I mentioned earlier, like the counseling center, your faculty, your chair, other students, like that is gonna be so important. Setting boundaries, taking days off, right? Paying attention to your physical health. Like I said, I went into the PhD and my back was tore up, but I made sure that I got accommodations from disability services so that I could get through to the next phase, right? Finances, at some point, finances is gonna, something is gonna happen. Something always happens. Either you didn't get your refund check on time, or you lost your job, or finances is always going to be an issue, but you always have to be able to pivot and ask for help. There were times I had built my brand so well that when nonprofits would call the faculty at Howard and the faculty were like busy, they would be like, oh, I know who would be perfect for that. And they would send it to me. And then I would get paid to do a speaking engagement at a local school or a local nonprofit. So building, that's like the building your brand part is so important because once people know your work, then when they see opportunities and maybe they don't have capacity, you're going to automatically come to their mind and that might be other extra income for you, right? Remove the you from failure. A lot of times we're so scared to fail that we don't even want to try. And the reality is that we just need to pivot and try again, right? And that just because you failed doesn't mean that you can't figure it out, right? It's like you just gotta bounce back and find a different way to do it, right? Um, Technology errors. Oh my God. During my PhD, I was during the time where, God, and knock on wood that it never happens again. But, but Howard received a ransom and all of their online systems were taken over. And so I couldn't even email a professor for like 3 months. Like I didn't even have access to email. And so I just feel like technology errors are going to happen, especially as we rely more on technology. So whether it means saving your dissertation on multiple entities, save it on your computer, save it in a virtual drive, print it out, right? Like have it saved at every stage in like 3 different places, okay? Because what you don't want to be is that student who has 200 pages and now it just deleted from Google Drive by accident, right? Um, the next thing I'll say is, and you know, this sounds terrible, but it was probably the best one of the best things that I did. I did strategic academic stalking. Not like real stalking, but like kind of stalking. But if I sent an email to my chair, because my chair was my dean, which I was very strategic about choosing the dean to be my chair in that sense, I knew she wouldn't have so much time and capacity, but I wanted her to have access to um my dissertation because I wanted it to be a reciprocal learning opportunity to expand the curriculum within social work to include more diverse Black voices. And I also love the fact that she worked in administration, in leadership, and she was also doing social work and higher education was like the cusp of all the interdisciplinary work that I was doing. So I chose her very strategically, right? On different levels. But I stalked her often. If I sent her an email and she didn't respond within 2 to 3 days, I would just nicely walk by her office. Like I wouldn't like go in or barge in or anything, but I would just make sure that she saw my face. If I knew that she was gonna be at an event that week and I hadn't heard from her, I would just nicely just come say hi after the event and be like, "Oh, did you see my email? Okay, yeah, no problem. Okay, yeah." But I wouldn't like push it or press it, but it was like I was very strategic about making my face seen um because I wanted to finish. And I knew that my dean had so many other competing priorities, right? And so I wanted to make sure that me as a priority was at the top of her mind, right? And so I was very strategic about popping into the office, very kind, very nicely, very gentle reminders, right? Because I can't tell the dean what to do. Um, but that she saw my face and that she saw my energy and that for me, I think was a huge part of why I was able to get out in the 5 years. The last thing I'll say about asking for help is eliminate perfectionism for real, for real. Just in life in general, but definitely during the PhD. I will say B's get degrees. Ain't nobody checking for your GPA once you finish the PhD. So, so do not take yourself out. In terms of committee selection, I think, this is really important and you really need to understand a lot of the nuances behind it, right? So when you're selecting your chair, and like I said, like this is why like building that community early on is going to be so important because having had those independent studies, having taken classes in the consortium and in other departments and in your department and doing research assistantships, those are going to allow you to build those relationships so that when it is time to choose your chair, you already know who you have a pretty good working relationship with, who you can take constructive criticism with, and who you actually just like enjoy, right? Like, do you enjoy their presence? Because if you don't enjoy their presence, you probably don't want to have to meet with them for the next 2 to 3 years while you're writing the dissertation. So picking your chair, I think, is very important. And paying attention to, who you're picking, are they graduating people? How long is it taking for the people that they are mentoring to graduate, right? So if you pick a chair, they haven't graduated a PhD in the last 10 years, that might not be the right person, right? And then going back to those people that I told you that have to be in your community, like this grad student 1 year ahead of you, the grad student who's close to graduating, who do they pick for their chairs? How was that experience? Sitting down with them for coffee to find out before you put in a final decision, right? Having realistic expectations. You can't submit your paper to your chair and expect them to get it back to you in 24 hours. Like everybody's human, people got kids, people got work, people got other priorities, right? So you want to give your chair at least a week to 2 weeks of business days before you start to politely stalk them, right? Making sure that you're also setting realistic expectations in terms of when you would like to graduate, communicating that to your chair once you have selected them and sitting down and setting up a timeline. Like, hey, if I would like to graduate at this date, do you think that's realistic? And if you do think it's realistic, what do I have to do to get there? What do you need from me? What kind of timelines do you need so that we can meet the deadline set by the university and you can get the edits in so I can graduate on time, right? And so, if your dean says, okay, well, I need you to send me your paper. If the deadline is the end of April, I need the paper by the first week of April so that I can review it and make sure that it's in by this time. Okay? So you need to literally sit down and craft that timeline with your chair to make sure that you're meeting all of the deadlines, because there's a deadline for candidacy, there's a deadline for your proposal defense, there's a deadline to get in for your final defense. And so knowing what those deadlines are, they're usually released by the graduate school every year, making sure that your dean or your chair, whoever it is, knows when those deadlines are and when you need to get them things so that they can meet those deadlines and you can work collaboratively towards your success. Understanding the culture of your department is also really important. Whoever you pick as chair, you should never go behind their back and choose another committee member without passing it through your chair first. Why? Because it's just real. Not everybody likes everybody. And you don't want to pick someone that doesn't have a good working relationship with your chair. You want harmony, okay? In your committee and in your life. So making sure that after you choose your chair, that you're also working with the chair to collaborate to come together with solutions that make the most sense. One, for your research, two, for your mental health, and three, so that your chair is also happy, right? Because the harmony is not just about you, there are multiple stakeholders involved, and respectability politics is big. So being mindful of that is super important. When you're thinking about your committee, though, you should be thinking about a content expert. So I was very strategic in that I brought in a content expert who focused on Afro-Latino identity, okay? They didn't have it available within my department, and actually, they didn't have it available at the university. So I actually had to submit an exception to the graduate school with the CV of the external committee member who was going to be my internal committee member, okay? And I was approved for this exception, which again only happens if there isn't a content expert on the campus already, right? Then I chose someone who was very knowledgeable on my theory, and then someone who was very knowledgeable on the methodology that I wanted to use, so that by the end, when I got all my feedback from my dissertation, I was able to get expertise in every area of my dissertation so that I could feel confident about submitting a dissertation that was intellectually stimulating and would make me look good and Howard look good and my dean or my chair look good, right? So when you're thinking about selecting your committee, there is a lot of strategic planning that should be going into place. The next thing I will say is identify your IRB savior, okay? Your IRB savior is someone in your department, if you're lucky, that sits on IRB or that just be submitting IRBs left and right. When I was at Howard, a lot of my faculty were close to retirement, and they were not necessarily submitting IRBs, nor had they ever submitted an electronic IRB. And so they could not serve as my IRB savior. And so luckily, thanks to the community that I built, I actually found the IRB savior in another department who was very willing and open. They sat on the IRB board. They was also a faculty member, and they set aside time and they walked me through after I got my IRB declined every single thing that I did wrong and helped me improve it so that when I submitted it the next time, I actually got it approved, right? So you need to do the work and figure out who your IRB savior is, because let me tell you, baby, if not, you could be here a long time, okay? The next thing you want to do is think about external committee members, right? So usually, every department is different, so I don't want to assume how many people have what numbers. I know in my department, we have a certain number of faculty and then one external committee member, right? But start thinking about that external committee member is important, right? Because they come at the end and, they help with like the final edits to your dissertation. And you can make a suggestion to your chair who you want to be the external committee member. But they basically look at your dissertation at the end of its entirety, right? And they give you feedback at your defense, right? And so, being part of those conferences, utilizing the consortium, like bringing in faculty into your community from the outside is good because that can give you some potential external committee members that you're like, oh, okay, that person's dope. They're doing similar research to me and they seem like a cool person. I'll bring them in as my external, right? The last thing is you always want to consult. There's going to be conflict along the way. There were times where I felt frustrated when working with my chair, and that's normal. We're human. Find the consultant, someone that is going to keep what you say to them and not go back to the source, but also allow you to process how you're feeling and give you advice on how to move forward, right? And how to best handle this, right? Like, oh, I haven't heard from my chair in such and such amount of time. I'm not sure how to handle it. Or, my chair mentioned that I should do this edit, but I'm kind of feeling ethically, uncomfortable with it. How do you think I should handle that? Right? So someone that maybe is like close enough to your chair, but not so close that they're gonna go back and tell them. But that knows them enough to be able to, it's like when you go to your aunt, because you're like, I don't know what to do with my mom, right? And she's like, listen, this is how you handle your mother. Something like that. Okay? So we all need someone to consult with during those times of conflicts because it's gonna happen. We're human. And that's just how it is, right? You can also bring people, I've seen also intermediate. I've seen sometimes people bring in members from the graduate school when they're having challenges with their chair or with a dean to kind of mediate between them and the dean. But I would say that's usually when it gets to a point where you feel like you cannot resolve it in-house, right? In terms of writing and what I did to be successful, and I'll be wrapping up in the next 2 minutes, I paid attention to the times that I was alive to write, right? And a lot of times that was in the mornings for me at least. I did a lot of virtual writing groups and in-person groups. So through a lot of those virtual communities that I mentioned earlier, they a lot of times will drop a Zoom link in their group chats where students can like mute themselves and just log in and write virtually together. And that helped me a lot. Having a writing ritual is also very helpful. So maybe you need to like light some sage, light a candle, say some positive words of affirmation, watch an anxiety meditation before you sit down to write, stretch before you sit down to write. Sitting at a comfortable setting, right? A table that's clear, not cluttered. So being intentional and setting space to write, I think is super important. And after having a writing coach, he talked a lot about separating your writing. So if you're gonna read, set aside an hour to read. If you're gonna read while you're writing, put a timer on. Don't dive for 3 hours into the reading while you're writing. Only do 15 minutes of reading and then go back to the writing. Because sometimes you can just kind of like zone out. You want to stay focused when you're writing on the writing. When you're doing editing, focus on the editing. So, if you're writing every day at 10 a.m., only write from 10 to 11. And then maybe set aside another hour on Tuesdays and Thursdays where you're just doing editing. And then set aside another time where you're just doing reading. So you try to separate those things a little bit. And that way, that'll give you more focus when you're in your writing sessions. I also use the Pomodoro technique, which is a technique where you take breaks. So you may write for 30 minutes, take a 5-minute break. write for 30 minutes, take a 10-minute break. Now as a professor, I only write for like an hour a day. I'm working on building a ritual where I can get to 2 hours a day, but we're not there yet, okay? And then these are like just the last kind of like tips and tricks that I would say is there are going to be waiting periods in your PhD. One of them being your IRB submission. My IRB took, I think, 5 to 6 months to get approved officially. During that 5 to 6 months, me personally, I was working on writing other publications with faculty to make sure that I had publications under my belt. So setting yourself up to be able to write those other publications while you're waiting for that IRB to be approved is a really strategic move. After you submit every chapter, so once you start writing the dissertation, right? After you submit every chapter, you usually get maybe 2 to 3 weeks while your chair is editing. I would continue my writing ritual and use that time to work on submitting an article, right? Or if I was co-collaborating with a professor, working on editing the article with them or doing the research with them, etc. So even in a time where I wasn't writing towards my dissertation, where I had these like lulls or gaps in my dissertation writing, I was using the other time that would free up to kind of make sure that I was still actively, writing and submitting publications. In terms of the academic job search, you should be preparing your materials 1 year in advance. So if you are looking to go into academia, that means you want to graduate next year. That summer before the year that you're graduating, you should be preparing all your materials because they hire in the fall for the following fall. Okay? Or even exploring non-academic options, which you should be talking to, your faculty about that as well, because not everyone is gonna get into a tenure track position. I hired a consultant. I made sure that I put money aside from the student loans that I took out, who helped me and walked me through all of the job search process. If you want to listen to her free content, she has a podcast called The Professor Is In. She also has a book that is super helpful that you could purchase for like $12 to $15. So if you don't want to pay to hire her as a consultant, you could literally just take advantage of her free services. There are also PhD coaches, which I hired a PhD coach as well. They kind of were my people who helped me when I was stuck sometimes. Sometimes I call classmates, sometimes I call mentors, and then sometimes I would just hire a PhD coach to walk me through where I was stuck at that moment. At the end of my dissertation, I hired an editor, best decision I ever made. Applying for grants was also really important. Like I mentioned earlier, building that brand early and consistent. And then part of my strategic stalking was also living near campus so that I could strategically stalk. I hope my dean doesn't watch this. But the last thing I'll say is, to end, comparison is the thief of joy. Your journey is your journey and no one else's. And no one's journey is better than anyone else's journey. It's just different. And so do not compare yourself to other PhD students. Some people are dealing with mental health, some people aren't. Some people are dealing with borderline homelessness, some people aren't. Some people have 3 kids, some people don't. Some people's faculty have grants and they're paying for their whole education, and some people's faculty ain't giving them any money to support them. Some people have research assistant positions, some people don't. Some people have teaching assistant positions, some people don't. So you cannot compare your experience. Some people are working full time throughout the whole 5 years. So your, productivity is gonna look different than someone who doesn't have to work full time or who can just literally not work the whole 5 years, right? I think the more important thing is that you're able to tell your story. And when you are applying for positions, you can say like, listen, like I was working full time while I was doing my PhD. I still got an A. However, that did impact my ability to publish. And so the right institution is going to accept you, and they're going to see your worth no matter what. But I will stop there if you want to stop the recording. And then if anyone has any questions and answers, I can give you a few more minutes.